Would you pray with me? Lord, I just want to lift up this morning to you. I just pray that the words spoken are your words and that you would just use your scriptures to impact our lives in ways, Lord, that are nothing more than miraculous. And I just lay this morning to you and all that's in it. In your name, amen. A few months ago, my son and I went to our family bank and we cashed in some savings bonds that we had been accumulating since he was a little baby. So the idea of a savings bond is pretty simple. It's basically a promissory note, and there's really no value in the paper itself. It's just a piece of paper. But what gives it its worth and its value is the fact that that bank has full faith and trust that when they turn those bonds into the treasury, they're going to be reciprocated those funds. So without that backing of our government, that promissory note really means nothing. A promise without faith is worthless. And we're going to be talking about three key figures in the Old Testament that kind of set up this display of an ultimate promise that God has given us. It's kind of like when you open up a brand new puzzle and you've got pieces scattered all over the place. And at least this is what I do. I try to find the flat pieces with the edges, and I start creating that framework. And then you grab all the pieces and you start working the puzzle in. And before you know it, all these chaotic pieces that are laying on the table start to form an image that you can recognize. When we talk about these three key figures in the Old Testament, I want you to really look at some of the detailed words, because when you start to see it, you're going to start to see the ultimate promise that God has given mankind. We're going to start with Abraham. And when we talk about Abraham, you can't not talk about his son Isaac, because they're both so connected. And we're going to be starting in Genesis. And in Genesis 17:19, it says, "Then God said, 'Yes, but your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you will call him Isaac. And I will establish my covenant,'" which is a promise, "'with him as an everlasting covenant,'" promise again, "'for his descendants after him.'" Now God had promised Abraham that when Sarah bore a son, it was going to be of many people, of a great nation. But here's the thing, Sarah struggled with fertility. She couldn't have a child. And she didn't believe that God was going to fulfill that promise. It wasn't until she was 90 years old that she conceived Isaac. Now, when you think about that in today's terms, it's nothing short of a miracle. There's just no doubt about it. And when this happened, she laughed, and she's like, "There's just no way." And Abraham's like, God set forth a promise, a covenant, that we are going to be the patriarchs of a great nation, and that is exactly what happened. Now we're going to fast forward to Genesis 22:2, and this is where I want you to really start looking at the key words in some of these passages. "Then God said, 'Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you.'" Now, okay, in order to have descendants, a bloodline, you have to have a child, right? At least a son. So here you've got this promised son. God is asking Abraham, "I want you to go kill your son." And you have to kind of think, what's going on in Abraham's head? Like, God, you promised me that I was going to have a son that was going to bear a great nation. How can I do that when my son is dead? And I have to think perhaps Abraham's thinking, well, I don't know, maybe God will give me another son. Or maybe he'll raise Isaac from the dead. I'm not really sure. But in order for Abraham to have the faith to trust in the promises of God, he had to trust in something so much bigger than what he was being told or seeing. So he goes up to that mountain, is just about ready to thrust that knife into him, and God says, "Stop, don't do it. Wait. I knew that you valued my promise, I knew that your heart was in the right place. I don't want you to do it. And I'm going to honor that promise by using Isaac to be the patriarch of descendants that is going to build a great nation. Now we're going to fast forward to Moses, and then I'm going to go into a story. So in Hebrews 11:23-28, Moses is described in this story, basically kind of a synopsis of his entire life, especially when it comes to Egypt. Because when we talk about Moses, we're talking about the Passover, which is something that is even regarded today as one of the most sacred Jewish holidays. So we're going to start in verse 23. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born because they saw he was no ordinary child. And they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as the greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith, he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who was invisible. By faith, he kept the Passover and the application of the blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. Now, if you're not familiar with the Passover, and I would have to think most are, this was really the kind of final blow to the nation of Egypt right after all of the type of plagues that we're familiar with, the frogs, the insects, the water turning into blood. But this one really was the death knell for Pharaoh, because what it did is God just said, look, if you don't post blood, lamb's blood over your doorpost, there's basically going to be an angel of death that's going to come through, and I'm going to take the life of the firstborn. And so that's exactly what happened. And those who had the blood marking on their door, that death was spared. And that is something where we look at with Moses is probably the greatest achievement that he had, even though he pulled the people out of the most powerful nation at that time. Egypt was just a guiding light when it came to military and art and technology and all the things at that time. But God reduced them to rubble. And it was because of Moses' faith in a promise, not something that he could see. I mean, you think about what he would have at his disposal at that time. He could probably have every material thing he could imagine. A military post, power, women, money, you name it. And he looked at it and he's like, it's just all fleeting, because I know that there is going to be a promise that is far greater than just the things that I can see. About 25 years ago, I had graduated from college. I had a degree in journalism and communications, and at that time I had written for some magazines. I was a newspaper editor and a reporter. But during that time in our nation's history, politics and Christianity were really kind of intertwined. And I really believed that God was going to use me in a very mighty way by entering into, not necessarily going into an election to hold a position, but to work for politicians. And I had a chance to work for a very wealthy businessman that was vying for a national position. And he really, at that time, was very well known. Anyone who was probably 40 and above would recognize this man's name. And so I had the opportunity to work for him, and I was introduced to the inner workings of politics, and at first it was great. But then as the time went on, I started to see the underbelly of how things worked. Now, I was fresh out of college. I lived a very sheltered life, very green and innocent, and a lot of this stuff really shocked me a lot. And as I started to get contacts, and there were people in Madison that I started to know more and more, there were promises that were thrown at me. Hey, Kris, we promise this will happen, and this is going to take place. And then I started to see how these politicians worked. And you know how they say that the blood of politics is money. Well, creating a promise isn't far behind, because anyone can create the promise. But if there isn't anything backing that promise, if there isn't faith that you can really rely on in that promise is worthless. And you start to put your faith in people, the system, what it can offer, the byproducts of that system. And it wasn't until I attended a dinner that I realized this is not where God wanted me to be. I remember attending this dinner. I was praying outside of this really extravagant restaurant, and I can remember, and it's easy to look back on it now, and I don't know if you guys do this, but I tend to sometimes over-spiritualize things. And I was out there, it was a beautiful night, and actually a shooting star went over the sky, and I thought, it has to be a sign. God is going to use me in politics. I just know it. And I just wanted it so bad. But it wasn't until I attended this dinner and I started to mingle with some of the high rollers that were in this sphere of influence that I realized God had something very different for my life. So now I want to go back to our third patriarch, and that's King David. David is arguably probably the most popular, the most influential king in Israel. And when I think about David, I think about a man who is highly flawed, a man who there's weakness and there's cracks in the armor, and he represents people just like you and I. Why I love the Old Testament so much is God uses ordinary people in extraordinary ways. And you think about what these people were dealing with. They didn't have the advantage of a fully published Bible that they could go back and look at stories and be like, oh yeah, I get that. And hindsight is always 20/20. And these people didn't have a guiding manual for life like we do now. A lot of these people were kind of winging it. It was by faith, and they're like, let's just hope this really works out. And I think for a lot of these people, that's exactly what it was. David was a military man, a strategist. He was a risk taker. He kind of reminds me of someone who was perhaps like a Robin Hood and like a Patrick Swayze in Roadhouse. The type of guy, he was very good looking, knew how to fight with his hands, and was the type of guy you would want to have in the back alley if you were in a fight. I mean, this guy knew how to handle himself. And he was very good on his feet and was very good, very street smart type of guy. So we're going to talk about David, and we're going to start in Ezekiel 34:23. And I will set up over them one shepherd, my servant David. He shall feed them and be their shepherd. And then it goes into 1 Chronicles 18:14. So David reigned over all of Israel, and he administered justice and equality to all his people. And this is the one that we're most familiar with, Acts 13:22. And when he had removed him, he raised up David to be their king, of whom he testified and said, I have found in David, the son of Jesse, a man after my heart who will do my will. Now, this is a man who committed adultery, a man who committed murder to cover it up. He had a very dysfunctional family. Matter of fact, one of his sons tried to take over his kingdom. This is a man who knew that when he messed up, he went back to God and he's like, I know I messed up, Father. I know what I did wrong, and I'm asking your forgiveness, and please help me to better myself. He understood that there were promises that were far more greater than what life was showing him. I mean, this is a man who was a king. He could have whatever he wanted. He had adoration of people. When he would come back from battles, David, his tens of thousands. This is a man who lived quite a life. But at the end of the day, there were flaws and weaknesses just like you and I. But what set him apart was that his faith was not on what he saw. His faith was the promises that he didn't see. And God honored that despite all of it. It's amazing how patient God can be because he knows really how flawed we are, but yet he still decides to use us. And David is just a key example of that. So going back to that dinner, it was a dinner where I actually got to meet the governor of Wisconsin. And I started to mingle with all sorts of different politicians, but there was one man that stood out above the rest, and I still remember this guy like it was yesterday. He was average height, he had a tailor-made suit, and the thing that stuck out the most was how he held his wine glass, because he had a napkin in his hand, and he had the base of the glass like this, almost as if, when you go to a wine tasting and you kind of go like this. And that's how this guy carried it. And I just thought, wow, I want to be that guy, Even though I don't like wine, but it looks cool, So we started talking, and he wound up, I found out, was a lobbyist for a Fortune 500 company. And we started talking about politics, and the more I talked to him, the more sickened I got. Because what I realized is that the promises of politics, they can be sold to the highest bidder. And it's really not a promise. It's a commodity. But for God, a promise is not a commodity. A promise is a way of life. A promise is a lifeline to save us from this life. What man does is he takes those promises and he wants to sell them to the highest bidder. It'll be something that one day it'll be there and the next day it's not. And I can remember driving away that night from that dinner, and I knew God was telling me, I have something so much bigger for your life than this, Kris. I don't want you getting mixed up in this. And I think I had to kind of get it out of my system and see it for myself so that I really could just firm that up in my heart. Now, do you remember when we were talking about how this faith and promise thing is kind of like a puzzle, and you start putting the pieces together? When we were talking about those scriptures, did you see those key words that I was talking about? So let's go back to Abraham. And we were talking about setting up an everlasting covenant. And it says, take your son, your only son. Okay, that's one piece. Then we go back to Moses, and we start talking about what he did through faith with God, saving the nation of Israel out of slavery. But the ultimate one was the Passover, the blood of the Lamb being marked on the doorpost. Then I think about David, a man who was a man after God's own heart, who had a sensitive side to him, despite being a military man, a soldier, someone who had shed a lot of blood with his hands. But yet he was so in tune with God that he realized that I need you, God, despite all of this, all of the things you've gifted me with. At the end of the day, what really makes life whole and matter is the promises that you have given to me. And he was a man after God's own heart. But who comes to mind as the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords? It's Jesus. And at the end of the day, those pieces of the puzzle start to form the ultimate promise that God has given us. The Old Testament really is just a precursor to God saying, look, I have a promise coming to you that you can't even imagine, something that's going to help you get through this life, but it's also going to give you the gift of life that will never end. And that's my son, Jesus Christ, who is God's only son, the blood of the Lamb, and the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. About 3 months ago, I had a chance to go and have dinner with my brother and my sister. And I hadn't seen them in a couple years. And so we went to go have dinner at a place in Lake Geneva. And unbeknownst to me, it was on a Saturday. It was during an art festival. And I will tell you, the thought of having a colonoscopy was less stressful than trying to find a parking place in Lake Geneva. So as I pull into this parking lot, there is this small SUV that is backing up. And I'm honking on the horn because this car is coming back at me, and this car pulls in. And my sister walks out. And I will show you a picture of this car. That's what her car looks like. And so I'm like, Lori, what are you doing? Are you kidding me? And she's like, well, Kris, I'm sorry, but this is just who I am. And I immediately felt very sorry for my sister. Because when I look at a car like that, and we are living now in a very politically charged society. Our nation really, there are some people dubbing it as the silent civil war. And I think there is a lot of truth to that. But every time I look at all of those different stickers, there's probably 40, 50 stickers on her car. Every one of those, to me, represents a broken promise. Something that a politician or someone said. And what really just broke my heart, because I don't know really where my sister is spiritually. She grew up in the church just like I did, but we've had many, many discussions about spirituality and Christianity, and we definitely have different opinions. But we live in a time right now of grace and mercy. We live at a time right now, despite what the press will tell you, of unprecedented wealth. And if you look at our nation right now, we're at peace. We've had much harder times in our nation's history than now. And I look at it and I say to myself, if people are this unhappy now, what's going to happen when this stuff is taken away? Because right now, even though I believe as a nation we have turned our eyes away from God, God is still merciful in his promises. And there are byproducts of those promises. Right now we have peace, prosperity, there's stability, there's mercy and grace spiritually. But what happens, and I will tell you, even for myself and a lot of Christians, we focus on the byproducts of those promises. We don't focus on the one that is giving us that promise. Our faith is in things or money or political systems, when God is saying, I want you to focus on me. I'm the one that has given you those promises. And I really believe that's why our society is dealing with so much emptiness. It's dealing with so much strife, and they're trying to figure out, where can I find anything, a solid footing? And I look at some of the things that our kids are dealing with, even at school right now, the society that we live in. And there are things that are happening now that I never thought I would even see in my lifetime. The fact is that God is a God of promises. And when you link faith and promise together, there's a power that can happen. Because when that happens, you can start to see the invisible. You can give the impossible, and you start to trust God for everything that you have in life. I will tell you, as a person who's grown up in the church, I have struggled with this a lot. God has blessed our family. There are times where my faith is far more into the things that I can see. And then there's this emptiness that just kind of comes over me, and it's almost like a moment of darkness, and then God's like, you know what, because Kris, I never moved, you moved your sight. It's a matter of you focusing on promise, the promise of me, not the things of this world. We are a very outreach church. We really try to impact our community. And like Zach was saying earlier, this is a very tough community to do church. And there are neighbors and coworkers and family members and friends that we can impact. And I think what we really have to just focus on is God's promises. And that fullness is going to start to come back. You think of people that we talk about in the Bible. It was by faith that Moses could do it. It was the fact that Abraham had a covenant with God, and David's heart was so sensitive to God. Those are things I think we've lost, not only in our secular society, but I really believe in our church today, too. The church, unfortunately, mirrors the culture. And it's something that's just been very convicting. And so as we start a new week, think about the promises of God. Because people are going to fail you. The systems of this world are going to fail you. And it's not to say that there's great blessings in life, but those can't be our focus either. God is saying, focus on the one that gave you that promise, and that's me. And I will use you in ways you cannot imagine.
I appreciate Kris talking about how those Old Testament promises come to life in the life of Jesus. And the promises that God made through Adam, through Abraham, through Noah, through David, through Jeremiah, all those come and converge at the table. The fulfillment of the promise that God makes at the very beginning of time that Ryan talked about 2 weeks ago, to fix what's broken, what he talked about last week. God continues to move throughout the history of the Old Testament, like Kris talks about. And the fulfillment of the promise, which Tony will talk about next week, is met here at the table. From the night in which our Lord Jesus was betrayed, he took the bread, he'd given thanks, he broke it, gave it to his friends, saying, "Take and eat, this is my body broken for you. Whenever you eat this, do so in remembrance of me." In the same way, he took the cup, he gave it to his friends, said, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, the new promise in my blood, shed for you and for all people for the forgiveness of their sins. Whenever you drink this, do so in remembrance of me. For as long as you eat the bread and drink the cup, you proclaim my promise to the ends of the earth." You don't have to be a member of the River Church to partake in the meal. You just had to walk through the doors today. We practice by way of intinction, meaning you're going to come up, you're going to rip off a piece of bread, you're going to dip it in the chalice. Both are grape juice. If you need a gluten-free option, it is on the right side of the table. Church, this is the promise fulfilled at the table. All are welcome here.